Hi, I'm Marion Buller. I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people, also known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I was a judge here in BC for 22 years and then went on to be the Chief Commissioner for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. But I'm also a grandma, a stepmom, a sister, an auntie, a niece, a cousin. And I'm also a member of the Mistawasses First Nation in Saskatchewan. I want to thank the Halton Catholic District School Board for inviting me to speak with you today. This is an important time. October 4th is the National Sisters in Spirit Day, also known as the National Day for Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada. I know you've had your own ceremony, and I congratulate you on that. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the grandmothers for leading you in that ceremony, acknowledging our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's time to commemorate their loss and move forward in a good way. I'm going to talk today about the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, our findings of fact and calls for justice. So, turning to the National Inquiry, we commenced our work on September 1st, 2016, and we finished our work on June 30th, 2019. Our terms of reference are very lengthy. I'll paraphrase them. They are to require us to inquire into all systemic forms of all types of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and to make recommendations to end that violence and to find ways to commemorate our lost loved ones. During the time of the National Inquiry, we heard from almost 2,400 people made up of family members of lost loved ones, survivors of violence, traditional knowledge keepers, elders, frontline workers, academics, a variety of people. And I am so grateful to all of you who shared your truths with us. You rewrote Canadian history by speaking up and speaking out. As a result of the work that we did do, we produced an interim report in November of 2017, and then our final report in June of 2019. We made some controversial findings of fact based on the truths that we heard and the research that our fabulous research team did. We tried to do our work from an Indigenous perspective as much as possible, and also from the perspective that Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, Two-Spirit people, are rights holders. They hold human and Indigenous rights. In the course of our work and our findings of fact, we stated very clearly that Canada is not the country that we thought Canada was and that we were taught Canada was and is. And we also pointed out very clearly that Canada is not the country that the international community thinks we are, because we are not embracers of human and Indigenous rights. And Canada experiences racism. We are not racism free. More specifically, and I have to refer to my notes to make sure I haven't missed anything here, we found a persistent and deliberate pattern of systemic, racial, gendered, and human and Indigenous rights violations by the Canadian state that were designed to displace and eradicate Indigenous people. This pattern of rights violations is the cause of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and is genocide. Genocide that is both historical and ongoing. We used the United Nations finding of genocide, which is more than mass killings. And again, I have to read in the aspects of the UN definition so I don't miss anything. The UN definition of genocide includes killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring transferring children of the group to another group. We know from our evidence, from the truths that we heard and the research that was done, the residential school system, the 60s scoop, the current foster care system, birth alerts, forced sterilizations, forced relocations of entire nations of Indigenous people, state-imposed and enforced generations of poverty and marginalization, lack of education and inadequate health care, all more than substantiate our findings of genocide, both historical and ongoing. But our report is more than just one word, and that of genocide. We also examined resilience. We examined things that work, programs that work to end violence. So I hope that I've captured a bit of your curiosity. Our recommendations are called for justice, and we made 231 calls for justice. They are aimed at specific groups. And again, I have to look at my notes so I don't miss a group. We made calls for justice aimed at all governments, including Indigenous governments, media and social influencers, health and wellness providers, travel and hospitality industries, police services, attorneys and law societies, educators, social workers and child welfare workers, extractive industries and development industries, police services, Correctional Services of Canada, and calls for justice specifically aimed at Inuit, Métis, and 2S people. We wrote a separate report with findings and calls for justice regarding Quebec. We also made calls for justice to include all Canadians, so that all Canadians have calls to work on. I want to start, though, with our perspective of human and Indigenous rights violations. One of our calls for justice is directed specifically at that. Our call for justice calls for an National Indigenous and Human Rights Ombudsperson. I'm sorry, I should have read my note from the beginning. And a National Indigenous and Human Rights Tribunal to hear violations of human rights in a timely, effective, and culturally appropriate way, because we know that domestic courts are expensive, take a long time, are very complicated, and in the end, people don't get the remedies they want or need. We also directed calls for justice at educators, specifically our call for justice 11.1 that states, again, I want to read from my note, all education institutions are to educate people about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in partnership with Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women, girls, and 2S people, and that education should include historical truths, Indigenous history, Indigenous laws and practices. And we recommend following our education guide called Their Voices Will Guide Us. So moving forward, this begs the question of school boards. Do you have Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women and girls and 2S people from your area, on your board as equal partners? If not, why not? Have you examined your curricula through an Indigenous lens, and have you indigenized your curricula? If not, why not? Here are some starting points for you to do your work. We made other calls for justice, and I'm going to read a few to you so you get a flavor for the work that we did do. As you know, we've called for a national action plan to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. We called for all governments to ensure safe housing, clean drinking water, and adequate food for all Indigenous people. We also called for an annual livable income for all Canadians. We called for changes in Indigenous policing and the child welfare system. We called for all people in media to take a closer look at the images they're portraying of Indigenous women and girls. We called on extractive and development industries to include impact assessments on Indigenous women and girls and 2S people as part of the work that they do to be licensed to move ahead in their developments. We also called on all government agencies to take a decolonizing approach to the work that they do. So what can I do as an individual Canadian? Again, I'll paraphrase our calls for justice because they're lengthy. First of all, we have to call out all types of violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, regardless of where we see it, when we see it, and how we see it. The same applies to calling out racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, whenever, however, and wherever we see it. All Canadians need to learn the true colonial history of Canada. All Canadians need to read our final report, if not the whole report, at least the final report executive summary. And all Canadians need to hold governments to account, including Indigenous governments, even if that means just vote. You know, we as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people have never taken the time to really talk to each other and to listen to each other. And that has to change. And we have to change how we do business. We have to change how we think. A paradigm shift, some people call it. We, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, have to be at all decision-making tables as equal informed partners. And those decision-making tables can be police boards, hospital boards, school boards, arts and culture boards, any board where decisions are being made. They have to be made in partnership and informed partnership with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. That's where we have to end up, an equal partnership. This is going to take work on both sides. It means Indigenous people have to step up and non-Indigenous people have to make room. But we can do it, one step at a time. We have to do this work. We have to end the genocide, and we have to make Canada the country we want it to be. I'm going to leave you with a final thought. We have to do this work to be informed partners, equal partners, so that Canada becomes the country that we want it to be, and the country we want it to be for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's children. We can do it. Thank you very much.